Okay, Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 11. Look at it again with me. Then contended I with the rulers, and said, Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. Nehemiah asks a question. Why is the house of God forsaken? If David could say, I was glad when they said, let us go up into the house of the Lord. If David could speak of it in such a high regard, such a enjoyment in his life to go to church, then why is the house of God forsaken? Today I hope to address that and give you 10 reasons why I believe that the house of God is forsaken today in 2020. Before I do so, I want to give you some stats, some statistics. This is pre-coronavirus, okay? So I'm sure these numbers are even much higher. I'm sure that the house of God is even more forsaken today than it was prior to when these polls were taken. 62% of U.S. churches are stagnant or declining in attendance. 62%. I'm sure it's much higher than that today. 62% of U.S. churches are stagnant or declining in attendance. 70% of all young people who grow up in church will stop going by their early 20s. That is a frightening number. 70% of all young people who grow up in church will stop going by their early 20s. I can't believe that's true. That's frightening to think that that could be true. Next, more than 3,000 churches close their doors each year. More than 3,000 churches, now remember this is pre-coronavirus, more than 3,000 churches close their doors each year. I'm sure this year the numbers will be much higher than 3,000. Many churches have struggled through this pandemic, and some are now opening their doors again. And then this last percentage, more than 30% of churchgoers say they have never felt God's presence at church. More than 30% of churchgoers say they have never felt God's presence at church. We are living in a day, an hour, where I believe prophecy is being fulfilled. There's a great falling away. Church attendance is in decline. People are abandoning the house of God. And I've asked myself, and I've asked even others, I've asked other preachers, I've asked other Christians this question, same question that Nehemiah has asked. Why is the house of God forsaken? Why is the house of God forsaken? I want to give you 10 reasons this morning. And I'm going to do it in such a way where we're going to start at number 10 and work our way down. Okay? So I want to give you 10 reasons why is the house of God forsaken. We will spend a majority of our time right here in Nehemiah 13. And we'll see principles, truths from this chapter on why the house of God was forsaken back then, why it is today, and then we'll give you the last point, which is going to be the most convicting, most challenging point, okay? So Nehemiah chapter 13, look at verse number 15 with me. Nehemiah 13, verse number 15. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and lading asses, as also wine grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish in all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them, and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. Point number 10. Why is the house of God forsaken? Why is the house of God forsaken? Point number 10 is this. Christians are working on Sundays. Christians are working on Sundays. Nehemiah says, what is going on here, folks? Why is the house of God forsaken? The reason why, we just read it, verses 15 to 21. They were too busy bringing in the sheaves. They were too busy taking care of their donkeys. They were too busy making their grape juice, their wine. They were too busy selling. They were too busy bringing fish and selling items on the Sabbath day. And Nehemiah says, listen, we're putting a stop to this. This is the Sabbath day. You're not going to work anymore. And he says, to the point where he threatens them. In verse number 21, he says, towards the middle of the verse, he says, if ye do so again, I will lay hands on you. In other words, he's saying, if you break the Sabbath, you're going to jail. If I catch you selling something, if I catch your shop open on the Sabbath day, you're going to jail. So here's the 10th reason why the house of God is forsaken today in 2020, is that Christians are working on Sundays, just as they were here in Nehemiah chapter 13. They said, well, we have other things to do. We got a business to take care of. We have a family to support, so we need to make money. We have things to do and places to go, things to sell, people to meet. We are busy. Where the Sabbath should have been a day of rest. It should have been a holy day, a day that set apart, sanctified us unto the Lord. There used to be a day and age, not my time, not my age, not my generation, but maybe some of you that are a little bit older, I won't look at anybody, but you can probably remember when most places were closed on Sundays. You couldn't go to a clothing store. You couldn't go to maybe a restaurant or something like that. A lot of places were closed on Sundays. That's changed, and yet it's infected Christians. Christians are missing church because they decided that earning money, making a living is more important. That's the wrong philosophy to have. But I need that seventh day of work because I can't make ends meet. Listen, you put God first, He'll help you make ends meet. You go around God and try to make ends meet yourself, then you'll never make ends meet by disobeying God, by not respecting the Sunday that God has given us. So we need to put God first, and He'll take care of us. He'll make sure that our dollar goes farther than it would if we it didn't work on a Sunday. But there's people here today who made that bad decision to say, well, I'm going to take this job. It's going to require me to work every Sunday, but I'm going to do it anyway. They're not in church. And it goes, more importantly, just about not attending church. It'll affect your whole life. It'll affect your children. It'll affect your family. It'll affect your attitude. It'll affect your walk with the Lord. So number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. I think you see that very clearly from that, and how Nehemiah was very agitated. He was very upset about that they had broken the Sabbath day. So that's number 10. Christians are working on Sundays. That's why the house of God is forsaken. Number 9, look at Nehemiah 13, verse number 23. Nehemiah 13 and verse number 23 says, "In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Then shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against God and marrying strange wives?" The ninth reason why the house of God is forsaken is because of unholy relationships. Unholy relationships. Whether it be the marriage relationship, and having married a non-believer, marrying someone who's not a believer in Jesus Christ, or whether it be an immoral relationship that would keep someone from church. It could be being unequally yoked, such in this case, they were not to marry their own race or their own people, and yet when they were warned, God commanded them, they had Solomon as an example, they still married the daughters of Ammon and Moab and the other nations. And by marrying into a people that didn't have the same beliefs, it caused them to forsake the house of God. Very important. Some of you here can give a personal example of how hard it is to be faithful to church, or to be faithful to God, to be faithful to the house of God, having a spouse, or children, or a parent who discourages your beliefs, who tries to mock what you do and your emphasis on church. And unholy relationships, whether it be that unequally yoked relationship, or whether it be an adulterous relationship, immoral relationship, fornication. When people are involved in that type of sin, there's a conviction, and they don't want to come to church. So that unholy relationship that people have with people that they shouldn't have is a reason why this house of God is forsaken. So number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. Number 9, unholy relationships. Number 8, look at chapter 13, verse number 11. Nehemiah 13, verse 11. Then contended I with the rulers, and said, Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together, and set them in their place. Then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn, and the new wine, and the oil unto the treasuries. And I made treasurers over the treasuries, Shilma the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites, Pedaiah, and next to them was Hanan, and the son of Zachar, the son of Mattani, for they were counted faithful, and their office was to distribute unto their brethren. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offices thereof. Number 8 is an unwillingness to tithe. An unwillingness to tithe. Now, this could be in two ways. First of all, there are some people that, let's say they are not tithing, or not setting aside the tithe at the very beginning of the week, and it comes to Sunday, and then they're broke. There have been people that have used the excuse, well, I don't want to go to church today because at our church they pass the offering plate, and I feel guilty if I don't put anything in it. So I'd rather just stay home today because I don't want other people to look at me funny because I didn't put anything in the offering plate, or because I didn't have anything to give. Silly excuse. And I say to you, first of all, we should obey God and we should tithe and give. But that's a poor excuse. And as a pastor, I want you to tithe, I want you to give. But if you're going to say, I'm not going to go to church because of that, I'd rather you come to church, okay? I'd rather you do both, well, like tithe and put something in the offering plate, but I'd rather you come to church. Now, some churches have gone to the philosophy or to just the practice. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. We did it during the virus, where you just have a box in the back and you have an offering plate over here, and you don't take a collection, but if somebody wants to put something in there, they can. And some churches do that because they don't want to put pressure on anybody to give, because they don't want them to not come to church because of that. That is a silly excuse. That is exactly that, an excuse. And it's something that should never stop somebody from coming to church. Never, ever. We should come to church, but we should also come with a willingness to tithe and give, because, for this fact, a church without the tithes and offerings of its people will end up closing its door. It'll end up withering away. Like we said in our prayer, the church is not financed by the government, it's not financed by the local government, it's not financed by some outside organization. It's financed by the people that come to it. And so when giving is down, it affects the ministry of the church. And so an unwillingness to tithe. Josiah, you can just shut it off. It sounds like it's on life support over there. So let's make sure it doesn't, just shut it off so it doesn't start burning up. So an unwillingness to give. Many churches have to shut their doors because there's nobody that are giving. And here in our verse, we just saw that the house of God was forsaken, but then in verse 11, he gathered them together. And then after he gathered them together, verse 12, then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and new wine. You see, when the house of God is forsaken, not only is the attendance down, but that means the giving is down. That means the money that's coming in is down. And of course, this year our giving has been down. I thank you for all of you for giving faithfully and giving extra even. But that we have people that are not here today that were here maybe at the beginning or maybe at the end of last year who gave. And so when the house of God, when they forsake the house of God, it does affect. And so the same thing happened here in Nehemiah. But God has been good to us, and he's kept us meeting our needs. So I'm not in any way worried about that. But that's just a reality. So number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. Number 9, unholy relationships. Number 8, on unwillingness to tithe. Number 7, look at Nehemiah 13, verse 3. I've got to hurry here. Nehemiah 13, verse number 3. Now it came to pass, when they had heard the law, that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. And before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of God, was allied unto Tobiah. And he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, and new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. But in all this time was not I at Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king, and I came to Jerusalem. and understood of the evil that Elisha did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. Number 9, unholy relationships. Number 8, unwillingness to tithe. Number 7, pastors that have sinned. Pastors that have sinned. Here's Eliashib. He's the priest. He's the pastor of the house of God, if you will. He's the overseer of the chamber of the house of God, according to verse number 4. He was allied unto Tobiah. Well, who is Tobiah? Tobiah was a public official of the Ammonites. He was in the government of the Ammonites, if you will. And not only was he an official of the Ammonites, he was also an oppressor or an adversary to Nehemiah himself. Tobiah restricted the building of the wall. He tried to prevent Nehemiah from building the wall. And yet here's Eliashib, the priest, being friendly and being allied with Tobiah, with an adversary to Nehemiah. And not only that, he allowed this Ammonite to live in the house of God, the special holy place designated for the Jewish worship, like allowing an Ammonite, a heathen, to come in and to live there. He took up chamber there, it says. He stored his stuff in there. And so once Nehemiah heard about it, he came in and he got rid of it. Verse number 8 says, it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. He says, I'm getting rid of it. It doesn't belong in here. Here Eliashib, the priest, or the overseer of the house of God, sinned. He sinned against God. He did that which was unholy, which was wrong. Today, churches have suffered because of a pastor who has sinned. I can number church after church after church where their attendance was cut in half because of the sin of a pastor. I can tell you churches that have closed their doors because a pastor fell into some sin or some immorality or some wickedness. But it didn't have to be something as blatant as that. It could be just the sin of not preaching the truth. A pastor who stands up and doesn't preach the truth, that is a sin. And I'm accountable to God for what I preach. And if I say, well, I don't want to preach that, God, then I'm sinning against my boss. He called me to preach. He put me in charge here as the pastor. And I have to answer to him. I've got to do what he tells me to do. And if he says, you need to preach on separation. You need to preach on fornication. You need to preach on alcohol. You need to preach on having false idols. And if I don't do that, then I am sinning as a leader of the church, as a pastor. And so many churches, because they don't have a man of God who preaches the Word of God, technically that pastor is sinning, even though it wouldn't be something that we would consider a blatant sin. Churches are forsaken today because pastors have fallen into grave sin, because pastors are secretly sinning. And so I have to examine myself constantly. And I've said to the Lord, I was hesitant to share this with you, but I said to the Lord, if I am the reason why this church is not growing, take me out. Pastor, why would you say that to God? Listen, I don't want to be a hindrance. Now, he can take me out any way he wants to. Hopefully it's not, the way you think, but he may just move me, or he may just give me a different ministry, or he may, readjust my duties, or he could take me out the ultimate way, but I don't wish for that, of course. But I've gone to God because I know how serious it is. I don't want to be the reason why this church is not growing. So I confess my sins. Lord, I confess my secret sins, the sins that I don't even realize that I'm doing. We all need to do that, but especially a pastor needs to do that. And some churches are forsaken because it's the pastor's fault. Okay? Number 6. I got to hurry here. Look at verse 13 and verse 22. Chapter 13, verse number 22. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. Number 6 is this. Churches do not take a stand for anything. Churches do not take a stand for anything. Nehemiah 13:22, he says that he commanded the Levites to cleanse themselves. He commanded the Levites to separate themselves or to sanctify themselves. In other words, listen, you set this as a holy work, as a godly work, as a divine work. You keep it pure, you keep it clean, you respect it, you honor it. Churches do not take a stand for anything. That's one of the reasons why the house of God is forsaken, because why go to a place that is no different than the world? Why go to a place where it's just like a business board meeting at your job? Why go to a place where it's just like a social gathering at another quote-unquote church? Why go to a place that is just like the world? Why go to a place where I can listen to that same kind of music on the radio? Why go to a place where I can hear the same kind of preaching that I can hear by flipping on the TV station? Why go to a place that's no different? That's the attitude. Churches that do not take a stand for anything, they think that they're making the church more comfortable for people, but actually they're hurting themselves. Well, we can't preach on this because we don't want to offend anybody. And yet, by not preaching on that, there's other people that says, why go to a church like that? They don't stand for anything. So they lose the people that they are worried about offending, or they try to keep the people that they're worrying about offending, but they lose the people that want to hear the truth, that want to stand for something. And so churches do not take a stand for anything. When you do not take a stand for anything, nobody wants to be a part of something that's just average, that's just not different, that's just, there's no challenge. You ought to want to come to a church where you're challenged, where you are convicted, where you feel, well, I really need to work on some things. If you go to a church where you're never challenged, where it's just, oh, that was so good. I mean, there are churches like that, but you're not growing, you're not becoming more Christ-like. Churches do not take a stand for anything. That's number 6. That's one of the reasons why the house is forsaken, because churches do not stand for anything anymore. Number 5, now listen carefully, number 5 is this. Churches take a stand against things. So number 6, I said churches do not take a stand for anything. But number 5 is the house of God is forsaken because churches take a stand against things. Look at Nehemiah 13, verse number 1. Nehemiah 13, verse number 1. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and therein was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever. And now look at verse number 3. Now it came to pass, when they had heard the law, that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. Verse number 9. Verse number 9. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers. He commanded in verse number 9. Verse number 11. Then contended I with the rulers. He contended with the rulers and the government and the politicians. Verse number 17. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah. He contended with the smart alecks. He contended with the people that claimed that they were wise and that they were smart, that they were the intellectuals of the town. Verse number 17. Verse number 19, halfway through verse number 19, he says, I commanded that the gates should be shut. Verse number 22, I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves. Verse number 25, I contended with them and cursed them. So he's talking about commanding, contending, addressing, confronting people. That's what was lacking. Nehemiah had it in his heart, but that's what was lacking in Nehemiah's absence. Churches that do not take a stand against things. You see, people today are looking for a touchy-feely kind of a church, or a church that's just going to tickle their ear. A church where they can go and just feel comfortable. God doesn't want that. God says that He wants you to be hot or cold, not lukewarm. He said, I don't want you to be lukewarm. That's disgusting to me. I'll spit you out of my mouth, he says to the church of Laodicea. He said, I want you either hot or cold, one or the other. He said, I want you either white or black. There's no gray area. It's either yay or nay, or yes or no. There's no halfway. It's either truth or a lie. There's no such thing as a half-truth. It's truth or it's a lie. He says, I want to be clear as day, black and white. And churches that do not take a stand against things, that are just in business just to coddle people, just to make people feel good, that is not a church that is going to have the blessings of God upon it. Churches that take a stand against things are being forsaken because people just want to be comfortable. And we're all like that. It's 90 degrees. What do we do? Oh, it's too hot. It's 40 degrees. What do we do? Oh, it's too cold. We want it to be, right? 70 degrees, right? 68 degrees. We want it just right. Or for you, 75, 76. But we want it to be just right. We just want comfort. And people look for that when they go to church. A place where I'm going to feel comfortable. Rather than a place that preaches the truth of the Word of God. Rather than a place where I know God wants me. So churches that take a stand against things are going to be forsaken because people are not looking for the truth. They're just looking for a social gathering. Okay, number 4. Look at Nehemiah chapter 13 again. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1 again, okay? On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people. Notice that? In the audience of the people. And then look at verse number 11. Nehemiah 13:11 again. Then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together in the audience of the people. The house of God is forsaken today because of, number 4, TV and internet have replaced church attendance. TV and internet have replaced church attendance. Listen, watching a sermon on TV is not church. Watching even a live stream is really not church. And I know because of COVID, many churches have gone through that. But that's really technically not church. Technically, church, the word iglesia, is a called out assembly. So it's a place where people have been called out from their homes to assemble together at a specific spot. So if you're just staying at home watching on TV or watching on the internet, it's not a church. You haven't come out of your home. You haven't assembled together with other believers. That's what church is. But TV and internet have replaced church attendance. Somebody would say, if you ask them, where are you going to church? And they would say, well, I'm going to Bedside Baptist. I'm staying right at my side of my bed watching it. Or I'm going to a living room community church. I'm staying right there in my living room. So that's not church. TV and internet have replaced church attendance. And so because of that, the house of God is forsaken. Oh, I have something to do today. I really don't have time to drive to church and then drive home from church. I'll just catch a 30-minute message on some Christian network and that'll be my church for the day. No, that's not church. That's not biblically the definition of what a church is. And so many Christians. I know someone who stays home and watches a video of a sermon of one of their favorite preachers, and they call that church. That is not church. Okay? Church is where you come out from your own home. You're called out from one place to another place to assemble together with other believers who make up the body of Christ. That is church. And so we need to remember that TV and internet have replaced church attendance, unfortunately. Number 3, go to Colossians chapter 1. Number 3 is found in Colossians chapter 1. Now here's where we leave Nehemiah. We're going to look at 3 other points quickly and be done. But here's where they get convicting. They get right down to the bottom line, or where the rubber meets the road, if you will. Colossians chapter number 1 and verse number 18. Colossians 1 and verse number 18 says this. And he, being Jesus Christ, and he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he, Jesus Christ, might have the preeminence. Number 3, Jesus is not preeminent in our lives. Ouch. Why is the house of God forsaken? Number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. Number 9, unholy relationships. Number 8, unwillingness to tithe. Number 7, pastors have sinned. Number 6, churches do not take a stand for anything. Number 5, churches take a stand against things. Number 4, TV and internet have replaced church attendance. Number 3, Jesus is not preeminent in our lives. Meaning he does not have first place. Listen. You take your weekly planner, your weekly schedule. The very first event you ought to mark down is church. Before work. Before breakfast. Before your next meal. Before your next doctor's appointment. Before any... Because he's got to be preeminent. Meaning he's got to have the number 1 spot. So the most important thing that you do in your week is church. That is preeminent. That is making Jesus Christ top dog, if you will. I don't like to use, but you know what I mean. Top guy, top priority. He's the head honcho, if you will. He's number 1. He's my first priority. Jesus is not preeminent in our lives, and because of that, it's very easy to skip church. It's very easy not to assemble together. It's very easy not to go to church because Jesus is not preeminent. Because if he was, we would do what he says. And that's going to go to point number 2. Point number 1. But Jesus is not preeminent in our lives. Make sure the house of God, which is Jesus' house, the assembling together of believers, which is his body, he's the shepherd of this place. I'm just the under shepherd. I'm just his substitute every Sunday. He's the shepherd of this church. And when we skip, when we don't go, when we just play down as not being important, we're saying to Jesus, you're not important. You're not important, Jesus. You're not preeminent. My job is more important. My hobby is more important. My friends are more important. My family is more important. That's dangerous ground we're treading. Jesus is not preeminent in our lives. Number 2. We don't really believe we have to give an account. Now, this is getting tough here. We don't really believe we have to give an account. Look at Romans chapter 14. This is convicting. I was convicted, even though I don't ever miss church, practically ever, unless I'm on vacation. But even then, I try to go to another church, or unless I'm sick. But just reading this and learning and studying this, I was convicted. Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14 and verse 10 through 12. Romans 14, verse 10 through 12 says this, But why dost thou judge thy brother, or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So then, every one of us shall give an account of himself to God. Number 2, the house of God is forsaken because we don't really believe we have to give an account. One day we will. One day we'll stand before God and he'll say, how come you treat a church as optional? How come you treat a church as just if it's convenient? We're going to have to answer to God sometime. We're going to have to answer to God when he tells us, how come you chose to go there instead of church? That's convicting. And by our own actions, I wonder if we don't really believe that we have to give an account. Or maybe we forget that. One day we have to... I'm not saying you're going to lose your salvation. Of course, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that God is going to judge you and say, oh, I changed my mind because you weren't faithful to church, you're going back to hell. I'm not saying that. But you will have to give an account for the life you lived as a Christian. And there will be no excuses there. So we don't really believe we have to give an account. Because if we really believed we had to give an account, we would think twice. You think about how much more murder there would be if people didn't realize they would have to give an account, or they would have to be judged or be convicted or go to jail. Can you just imagine that murder was not against the law? How much more of it would be? Now, how much more people would do it? But because they know, oh, that's a capital offense, or I'll go to jail for the rest of my life. Well, not in every case, but or in some states it's still a capital punishment. I'll have my life taken, and that is the biblical way as well. But can you imagine if we had no thought of judgment, no thought of standing before a judge? The things that we would do. But yeah, when it comes to church, and it comes to skipping church and forsaking church, we forget that fact. One day we're going to stand before the judge, we're going to have to give an account. Lastly, point number 1. This is tough. This is very tough. Let me give you the verses first before I give you the point. John chapter 14. John chapter 14. And I'm just giving you the truth. I am no way standing in judgment of anybody. I'm no way trying to even evaluate whether or not the person truly loves Jesus Christ. I'm kind of giving away the point. Look at chapter 14. Chapter 14, verse number 15. John 14, verse 15 says this. If ye love me, keep my commandments. If ye love me, keep my commandments. Verse 21. Verse number 21 says, he that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me. I'll stop there. And then if you go to Hebrews 10, verse 25, there we see a command. In Hebrews 10 and verse 25, very, very well known. You've heard me probably say it dozens and dozens of times. But Hebrews 10, verse number 25 says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Attending church is a command of God. And Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commands. So if we don't keep God's commands, what does that say according to Jesus Christ? That we don't love him. I'm not saying that. He's saying that. He's saying, if you don't obey me, then you don't love me. That is tough. Here's the point. Point number 1. Why is the house of God forsaken today? Because we lack a true love for Jesus Christ. We lack a true love for Jesus Christ. We say we love him, and most people, when you ask them, you love Jesus Christ? Oh yeah, I love Jesus Christ. But Jesus says, it's not true love. Because if it was true love, you would obey me. You would keep my commands. We lack a true love for Jesus Christ. And those are the 10 reasons why the house of God is forsaken today. Number 10, Christians are working on Sundays. Number 9, unholy relationships. Number 8, unwillingness to tithe. Number 7, pastors have sinned. Number 6, churches do not take a stand for anything. Number 5, churches take a stand against things. Number 4, TV and internet replace church attendance. Number 3, Jesus is not preeminent in our lives. Number 2, we don't really believe we have to give an account. And then sadly, number 1, we lack a true love for Jesus Christ. I want you to start thinking of church in a different way. I want you to start thinking of church as a birthday party or a graduation party that Jesus has invited you to. Every service is that. Every service is an invitation that Jesus has given to you. And when you don't go, it hurts him. It hurts his feelings. He wants you there. It's not about putting in your duty. It's not about church being a noble thing to do. It's about, we love Jesus. We just want to be where he wants us to be. We want to follow his command. I'll close with this. D.L. Moody once recounted a call which he made with a prominent businessman, a leading citizen in the city of Chicago, to persuade him to accept Jesus Christ. It was winter, and the two men were seated before an open fireplace. When Moody's host made the assertion that he, quote, could be just as good a Christian outside the church as in it, unquote, Moody said nothing, but stepped to the fireplace, took the tongs, picked a blazing coal from the fire. The man says, "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. He set it off by itself to the side, sat down and said, "You'll see." In silence, the two watched it smolder and slowly go out. The host said, "Oh, I see." You see, if we neglect church attendance and attempt to live our lives alone or in a vacuum, the fire of our faith is soon extinguished. We cannot be a piece of coal separated from the fire. The church, the fireplace, is the fire. We're all just pieces of coal. We need to be together there. And if we separate ourselves from that, we'll die out. We'll diminish as a flame. We need church. We need to be in the house of God. And many Christians have forsaken the house of God, and they've brought destruction, hurt, pain to their lives. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the message, Lord.